Hello, everyone, and welcome to the August 3rd edition of the SIG Network meeting. Just a reminder that this meeting is under the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, as always, boiling down to basically be nice to one another, so please be nice to one another. Please try to use the raise hand feature in Zoom, as that can help us to organize interjections, comments, and stuff like that. We only have a couple, well, we have only a couple things, but one large thing on the agenda. It's an open agenda, so if you have anything to add, please do feel free to add it at the bottom. Anything that we don't get to today, we can roll over to the next meeting. I am feeling a little bit under the weather today, so please bear with me. I'm probably going to be a little bit slow. Carry me. I'm going to start sharing my screen.
Hope you feel better shortly.
Thanks. I'm good enough to be on here, so it's not too bad. All right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
All right, then we will get started. First, we're going to start with triage. I've already opened up all the unassigned triage items, so we can start going through that. The first one here is this ingress/health Z404 not found. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to look at this one yet, because or no, it was 3 weeks ago, actually. So we put in this ingress on Azure AKS, and in AKS, we import a certificate. Back and we point to ingress Nginx controller.
That's for the Nginx ingress controller project, right?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
It's not Ricardo. Okay, Ricardo.
Should I just CC Ricardo and
This feels like something that should be filed on Ingress Nginx repository, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, that's fair.
Or maybe it's, I don't know, but it does not feel like it's related to anything in K/K.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with that. I can take this one and kind of move it that way. I don't think I can actually move it. Maybe I can.
Yeah.
I'll figure that out later. Okay. Next one is from Jay. Should kubeproxy delete its rules when being gracefully deleted? He was replacing kubeproxy with Entria, their replacement, and all of these rules were still floating around in the cluster. And he would expect that they would not be.
Hey, Shane, can you make your window narrower again, please?
Sure. Is that better?
Much better. Thank you.
Yeah. So in the past, we've talked about should kubeproxy do its own cleanup on termination, and the general problem is it doesn't really know whether it's going down in order to come right back up, in which case tearing down its rules would be disastrous, or whether it's going down to stay down. We had this like kubeproxy -- cleanup flag that
This right here.
Yeah, we were never able to like actually keep maintained, and like it was never consistent enough, and we've, I think, more or less said we're not really doing that anymore. So unless somebody like Dan, tell me if you disagree.
So I think you're misremembering. We used to try to do cleanup on startup, where like we would try to clean up the user space rules if you were running IP tables, and we clean up the IP tables
That's
rules
right.
if you're using IPVS, and we gave up on that. But I think the cleanup and exit, I think that works.
Oh, okay. All right. So maybe I'm misremembering that aspect of it. Yeah, anyway, the point of cleanup and exit was to make the I'm going down in order to stay down an explicit thing. Obviously, that doesn't map well to like a daemon set being turned off.
Okay. So should I respond to this one? He left. Oh, wait, he already, Antonio already kind of made it clear. So should we, I guess I could take this one and just kind of try to move it to close with Jay, because he seems to be kind of getting that. Basically, I'll just check in with him and see if he accepts this or if he has any more comments. And if he does accept this, then we can probably consider this one closed.
Okay. I mean, the only real alternative would be to capture SIG term and say SIG term is not a normal thing. It means that the daemon set is going away and we handle that specially, but that feels really dangerous to me.
Okay.
Is his use case only building like using kubeadm to set up a cluster, and he just doesn't want kubeproxy to run or be installed? Because kubeadm supports that use case, so then he doesn't even need to worry about this problem.
Let me go back to the top. I think he's ripping out kubeproxy. Yeah.
I honestly think that
kubeadm.
we shouldn't clean unless we're told to clean. And the reason behind that is if you clean on exit or startup, you're basically introducing jitter in the cluster when the proxy restarts. Right? Because once you clean, there are no rules, no service for this node. So you don't want that, because even today, if we restart a node, sorry, not restart a node, if we restart proxy, everything works. All right, at least the existing rules will work. Right, the new rules until proxy comes up and does the cache and so on. Everything works. So I don't want to like assuming that we're dying forever.
Yeah, we can't do it on like the normal shutdown, right? Where SIG term is too normal. Like if we changed it to like SIG user 2 or something, and you say, oh, somebody sent me SIG user 2, that means really clean up. But that feels so delicate that I don't know if I want to embrace it.
His use case is still using kubeadm to create a cluster, then he's deleting kubeproxy. So he's creating the problem by not skipping the kubeproxy install in the first place.
Yeah. I added your comment here, basically to kind of check in with him. Because I think that, I mean, yeah, if you can just not, because right, you can flag it and say, please do not put kubeproxy.
Yep, you can skip whatever component you don't want to install.
Your comment makes perfect sense to me. So I'll go for that. Unless you want to make the comment on here, I'll just say that and just kind of try to.
I can comment really quick. Yeah, he's just
go ahead.
creating the problem by allowing the normal kubeadm process to go, and then he's unwinding it when he could just prevent the issue in the first place.
Okay, I'll grab it and kind of make sure I wrestle it to probably close is what it looks like. But yeah, please do add your comment there. Okay. The node IP passed to kubeproxiers is invalid.
Assigned to
Lars
them
is in here.
You can triage accept this where there's a PR already.
Cool. Who's working on that?
I am.
Are you okay with me just signing the issue to you so we just see that somebody's assigned to it? Is that fine?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Okay. Cool. 2 more. Service beta Kubernetes.io load balancer range. Yep.
It
What's
would
up?
be good if this is a very interesting thing, and it would be good if you can share some of the findings. I was trying to follow it, the previous one, I mean.
Oh, you wanted to? You asking Lars?
Lars or Dan, if they can summarize to us, because I was trying to follow it, and it's a super complex topic.
Yeah, it's
Summary.
like a Pandora's box. You can check
Right,
the last comments in the pull request, I believe.
That's why I think that this should be good to share with the whole community, because I mean,
Basically, bind address has a horrible name and it only does one incredibly obscure thing, at least on Linux. And
yeah, if you scroll up a little bit, I have a proposal. Very, very horrible. There it is. And that's like attempt to describe the current function of this. And the name is totally offside, and the meaning is horrible to understand.
But the broken behavior is only with IPVS. That's the part that I didn't get from this issue.
No, the broken behavior is actually only on IP tables. For IPVS, this flag has no meaning. It is used, but it cannot do anything.
Okay.
The big problem that's getting fixed here is that we never really dealt with dual stack for this. And so if you're on dual stack, you can only pass one bind address. And if we have to auto detect, we intentionally ignore the second IP in the node object and only look at the first one. And we're sort of trying to figure out if you know we're going to break anyone if we fix that. And it looks like no. So except maybe on Windows.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is that a good enough summary? Anything more to say on that one, or should we move on, Antonio?
No, just please go ahead. Sorry for I
Yeah, no
think
worries.
that this is interesting topic.
Yeah, no worries. All right, so this annotation not usable with external name. And Tim has taken a look at it. All right. Okay. Sorry, like I said, I'm going to be a little slow today. Does anybody have anything to say about this one?
I'm trying to figure out what they expect it to do.
Yeah, let's go back up. They want the annotation passed
But
along
the
with all the
load,
other LB annotations.
the load balancer controller shouldn't be doing anything around external name services. External name services, like in as much as they exist, are really just a shortcut for a DNS name.
Yeah. So they're trying to
You can
do
assign this
something.
one. You can assign this one to me. I'll ask the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Are they saying the AWS load balancer controller will honor that annotation if it receives it, even for an external name? That seems really interesting.
There's lots of really interesting things out there in software.
What did you expect to happen? The annotation is passed to the load balancer controller. Fascinating.
Well,
Okay.
I mean, first of all, it's a beta annotation which has been replaced by a field, so they can go use the field if they. Anyway, I'll respond.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it. All right.
What's the
Next.
field replacement?
The field is called load balancer source ranges.
Oh, I see.
Last one also from Lars. Can't restrict access from Kubernetes nodes with a load balancer source ranges for proxy mode equals. Oh, is this related to the other one? Oh no.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's found in the same neighborhood, but I cannot really see a solution for this problem when I have investigated the other problem. So maybe it's just to say that currently this can't be done. But I believe it's a problem, so it should be accepted, in my opinion.
Does the traffic to an IPVS service not transit IP tables? Like, couldn't
Yes,
we
it
install
does.
this? Go ahead.
But the load source ranges cannot be used because the source address will be the load balancer address in the IPVS case. So you can do it if you write the load balancer address as I cannot see it can be done in any simple way. But it is a problem, and it differs from IP tables proxy.
I'm not sure I understand.
Lars, if you do this, don't you have to? So you
If
basically
you
want to-
specify a load balancer source range and the node address is not included,
Right.
you are supposed to not be able to access the service from a node, but you
Right.
can in IPVS. Whatever you say, you can always access the service from the node.
So in IP tables, we write IP tables rules to only allow traffic from those source ranges.
Yeah.
Should we be doing the same in IPVS?
I don't think it can be done because the source address will be the load balancer address.
I see what you mean now, because right, of course, because that's a local address.
Yeah.
Can we not write an IP tables rule in terms of, there's got to be a way to do that.
Yeah, I agree. There's got to be some way to do it.
Yeah, some way, maybe perhaps, but I believe it's a bug and it should be accepted.
Okay. Okay, I agree.
And then we can see if it can be solved.
We also have somebody here, Kushal, who seems to want to work on it. I think I'm going to accept it and also mention to them, like, hey, let us know how you intend to fix that, because we consider it to be reasonably complicated.
Yeah, and my comment with the node IP doesn't work because the source is the load balancer IP. I missed that.
Right. Yeah, that's a really important point. When the kernel decides you're talking to this interface, it's going to pick that interface's IP as your source address. So you need to do something other than IP-based.
Unless you have a source directive on a route, right?
Yeah, and that leads back to the last issue I wrote, because you don't have the node IP address which needed to be sourced. So that's when it all started.
If you put a source on, then the kernel will pick it if there is no existing source address in the packet. I mean,
but you don't have a source. You cannot set anything because
exactly, because there's just a link local on an interface or something like that, and you're sending it to something that's not link local or similar, right?
Yeah. The reason I wrote the last issue was to set the source in roots, just because of these kind of problems. But the node IP I wanted to have a source is faulty, and it cannot be fixed in an easy way because the bind address messes things up.
But isn't it better to put policy rules on things like this? Or you can't?
Yeah, but I don't think we should discuss the solution on the meeting, but accept it and then take it.
It's accepted.
Can I add one item to the queue? It has an assignee me, but I thought it was worth talking about, which is 119700.
Go ahead.
So this came up in all the testing around combinations of, Antonio's laughing because he knows, the combinations of fields that service has, all the reasons that we dislove service for the various combinations of type and other fields that are allowed. We find that there was an E2E test which was tickling this, which escaped notice for a long time, which was that if you have a service of type cluster IP, and anything that's not load balancer type, you can patch the status to have a load balancer ingress. I think this says spec, but it should be status. There's code. We have code that specifically says when you update a service and the type is not load balancer, we wipe the load balancer status. And I remember writing that. And that's great if you're converting something from a load balancer to a cluster IP. But if I have a cluster IP service and then I'm allowed to patch the status, now I have a cluster IP that indicates there's a load balancer ingress, which is totally meaningless. I don't know if I haven't audited like kubeproxy. I think kubeproxy would ignore that, but it's not inconceivable that it might slip through and actually be trying to set up routes and stuff for it. But it's super volatile because the next time that service spec is updated for any reason, including changing a label or something, then that field will get wiped again. So the question that I posed to the group is, A, does anybody consider this to be a breaking change if we were to fix this? And B, how breaking are we willing to tolerate? And I wrote here the options. We could fix validation as we should have done and just say, no, you can't set this field unless type is load balancer. That's a really breaking change. So if anybody is actually doing this, it will stop them from working completely. We could just throw that value away and treat it as perfectly volatile. You set it, but it got wiped immediately. I thought we could maybe throw a warning, but it turns out the prepare for update code is called before the warnings code. So that's actually hard. Or we could just throw a warning and leave it the way it is and let it be volatile. Anybody have thoughts on this one?
So people are using this today, they are okay with updating every time, like losing the load balancer status and then they patch it again and again?
I mean, I can't imagine how that's useful. That's not to say that nobody's using it, but I can't imagine how that means anything useful.
Can we release with a warning, and then the next, like with a warning that mentioned that if we hear no, I don't know, we hear no feedback or something, we deprecate it in the next cycle?
We can. Warnings are generally human aimed, and patching status is usually a controller operation. So it seems unlikely that anybody will actually see it.
But we have this trick now, the feature gate, right? In the inverse order. Remember the one that you use it for the host?
Yes, we could add
That
a feature gate of status deprecated. That's a great point, Antonio. Okay, so we add a feature gate that is on by default, which says don't allow it. And then if anybody experiences a problem, they can go flip that feature gate and then we can talk about how to fix it for real. I forgot that was there. Yes, that's a great answer.
That sounds like a really good way to handle it.
And then we can actually do it in validation and just do it the right way.
Cool.
So the feature gate should be on by default, like status deprecate by default, and then they can just refer it back.
We usually think of feature gates as alpha, beta, GA, but there's a separate mode which is called deprecated, which is for this. Like we are putting a feature gate here in case you need to back out of this deprecation, but in very rare situations, we're willing to make these hard changes.
Okay. Yep.
That's a great point, Antonio. Thank you. Okay, I'm satisfied.
Antonio, do you mind throwing your idea onto the comments there for that one, please?
Yeah, think until the credit.
Okay, thank you.
No, seriously.
Oh, we can. Yeah, I can add it right now. I just thought I'd.
You can add it.
Oh, you do not. Okay. Well,
You,
all right, Tim.
go ahead, Shane or Tim.
Okay. I'll come back to it if Tim doesn't get to it.
I've got it open here. I'll just throw a note in there.
Cool. All right. I'm going to give the floor to Rob.
Cool.
Gateway.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize too much time here, but Gateway API, we're going to be trying to have updates every SIG Network meeting between now and our planned GA release in October. Trying to avoid any surprises in any direction between now and then. And we've got a pretty tight timeline before we want to hit 1.0. Before we get there, we are planning to release 0.8 this month. That includes three main things. One, it includes Gamma, our kind of mesh initiative. Is going to experimental, which basically means it's part of the release. It's something like you can use. Then we've got cell validation. At long last, we're embracing built-in advanced CRD validation. It will work for 125 and above, but Gateway API promises to support 120, the trailing 5 versions. So we will still need to, some users will still need to install the webhook. And then finally, there's some version bumps in this release. That means, changing which version is stored, served, etc. Just again, trying to line everything up so 1.0 goes smoothly in October. And yeah, as I mentioned, we're absolutely trying to make sure we have check-ins as frequently as possible in these meetings, and anything that comes up in our more regular Gateway API meetings that feels like it might be a little controversial, we're going to try and bring up to here so there's, again, less surprises as we go. And first up, Flynn had one thing about timeout formatting, and timeout formatting is the most complicated thing in the world, it seems like. So maybe I'll hand it off to Flynn and you can provide a bit more context.
So there's a very long comment at the end of this thing, but for our purposes immediately, the TLDR there, which is that, Shane, why did you make that smaller? That's very weird. The TLDR is that if you look at what Cell does and you look at other things that are already in the Kubernetes world, like MetaV1.duration and things like that, all of them boil down to Go's time.parse duration under the hood if you look at the source code. So A, we should probably just use that to reduce scope going into 0.8, but B, that format also has some horrible things like floating point numbers and very, very, very open-ended things that it will allow. So Rob came up with a regex that he and I both think should do a reasonable job of letting us put some bounds on what the input will actually allow, while still leaving the door open for discussing things like, well, maybe we should support days or weeks, but later. So I don't know what level of detail makes sense to dig into for this particular meeting, other than the fact that Tim just raised his hand. So Tim, over to you.
I think your regex is wrong. You'll allow octal seeming numbers. What does it mean if I specify 0777 minutes? Is that octal or integer?
This is for serious. Is there, you saw the regex and you find that?
My gut reaction is we document that it's decimal and on your own head be it, because it's very, very difficult for me to imagine anybody intentionally trying to do octal for things that are not Unix file modes in 2023.
Look, I'm on record saying you shouldn't use octal in YAML at all because it's completely broken. But anyway, I just looked at your regex and I immediately went, leading zeros.
Yeah. Well, also note that the unit at the end is required. So there isn't a way for YAML to interpret this as a number. It will always be interpreted as a string.
That's
so
true.
we don't have to worry about YAML itself giving you an octal value when you didn't mean one. We just have to worry about people thinking that they wrote an octal value and not getting it.
I guess the real question is what does Go parse duration do if I specify 0777?
It interprets. I'm 99% sure it interprets it in decimal, but hang on a second, because now
I'll test it while we're talking. So I read over this proposal yesterday. Sorry, did you want to keep going or do you want to talk about it now?
Yeah, we should talk about it now. Where I was going at the end of that was I'm honestly not sure what level of detail to get into, so I was going to stop and see if people had comments. And look, people have comments. So go ahead.
Got comments? Who's first?
You're the only one with your hand raised, so I think you can go ahead.
I mean, my hand was still up, but I read it over. Other than the possible little wart with the regex, it seems okay. For anybody for following along, the big issue here is when we embed a format into a string in our API, we require then clients be able to parse that to do anything with it. If you want to consume one of these types and you want to compare two different durations for some reason, if you're a controller and you want to say, is this duration less than 0, you need to parse it, right? Which means we need to write a grammar for such a string formatted field, which means we can never ever change it because it'll go out into client code and that client code will potentially never be updated. So we get one shot to define this. We can't expand it and we can't constrict it. We get it right or we get it wrong, which is why we've had such a huge debate about what we want to put here. Right? Like C, for example, parsing of IP addresses, which you think has a pretty well understood grammar, but it turns out that we were just using Go's embedded parser and its parser treats leading zeros differently than perhaps other parsers do. So the fact that we have a specifically formatted string carried value is a danger, and we need to make sure we get this right.
The Go code parsing this does in fact always interpret the numbers as decimal and has no provision for octal.
Okay. So we would need to specifically document that, right?
Very
again,
much so.
for those following along, this is why we're like, hey, let's not use floating point because then we have to describe what the accuracy of our floating point parsing is, right? And let's not do complex compound values like 1M30S, which Go parsing allows, but then our clients all have to be able to parse that.
But you'll note also that the proposal that I put in there does allow between 1 and 4 compound values, because we have support for parsing that in Go and in Rust and in Python already.
We do? Is that
do.
that a standard thing? Or we Kubernetes does, or those language communities do?
Well, so kind of both. Kubernetes obviously has support for it in Go. The kubrs crate in Rust just got support for this added recently. In fact, for this particular GEP that mimics the behavior of timed parse duration. So I will get to go to my colleagues and at Buoyant and say, let's rip the floating point part out of that, and that will probably make them happy. And Python has a pip installable package that also does the right thing. Boy's business. The implementations that I have looked at do support out of order durations and repeated durations, like you can do 10 milliseconds, 4 seconds, 60 minutes instead of 60 minutes, 4 seconds, 10 milliseconds. You can also do things like repeat hours and, add them up. It's hard for me to feel that that's a good thing. I would love to find a way to disallow that in validation. I'm not sure we have one.
Yeah. So whatever we decide here, we need to aggressively document what we claim to support, and we need to aggressively validate that we only get the things that we claim to support, and we need to have a published set of test cases that if you want to implement a parser for this, you'd better parse all of these test cases correctly.
Yeah, and I completely agree with all of those.
The fact that you said add them up instead of replace, that one got me a little scared.
It's
was
surprising. I
was
went and
surprised
tested it
by
as
that.
you said it. Yeah, as you said it, I was like, wait, really? And I went and tested it in the playground, and sure enough, 10S, 1S, it gives me 11 seconds.
Yeah, and if you look at the code, it's very apparent exactly what it's doing. It's a very, very stupid implementation, which is why I say I would.
Stupid.
Yeah, I mean, it's a predictable kind of stupid, and we can document it. And we can also put in test vectors. We can publish test vectors that either enshrine that behavior in stone or reject that
So-
behavior if we decide that we'd rather reject it.
So the other part of this that had me worried is about serialization and deserialization. And this is why I didn't like the meta v1 duration as a field type, because it deserializes as part of the, if I read it correctly, it deserializes, it has like a unmarshaled JSON. And if that unmarshaled JSON fails, basically if time parse duration fails, it's going to throw a 500 something internal error, as opposed to actually returning a useful, like, this is not a valid duration string. And that's true if you feed like an invalid, any string formatted thing that is invalid. This is why we don't, in APIs, we don't have IP addresses received into a net.ip or an IP NetAddr field, because the parsing gets done at unmarshalling time as opposed to at validation time. So instead, we receive it as a string and then we later parse it, which is also how we miss things. So what I would like to see here is that we define a Kubernetes type that we can stick somewhere, meta v1 or something, like maybe we replace duration. As far as I can tell, meta v1 duration is only used in a couple of config APIs, not in any public API.
I think that's correct from what I saw.
I see the chat, Antonio, saying probably something interesting about duration serialization. Of course there was.
Yes, because Jordan, so somebody related to this, I forget the details, but was related to that. They couldn't round trip. Okay, I don't remember.
Okay, so shocking. Most of the config APIs are not GA APIs. So if you need to go make some minor changes to the spec, that's probably doable. But I'd like to see us define it as a type which allows garbage strings in, but has a well-known validation function for handwritten validation, and which has a cell validation that does the right thing. Basically, what I don't want to see is everybody who embeds one of these types has to run this regex validation themselves. Does that
I
make
would
sense?
also agree. Yeah, I would agree with that too. Rob, go ahead since you're playing with your mute button.
Yeah, just trying to understand if we add this as a format on meta v1 as a Kubernetes lib, I think that means we need to wait for 129 then to be.
I will let you go ahead if we know that anybody who's following suit has a clean road. Like you can be the snowplow. Like I'm fine with that, right? But you got to leave a clean road behind you.
Yeah, that's fair.
Do you think that sounds reasonable, Rob? And I'm asking
Yeah,
you
I mean,
because I'm asking you because I'm happy to help, but I'm going to be leaning heavily on you for, you know, knowing much more about how this stuff already works than I do there.
Yeah, no, we can lean into the details later, and as you know, I think this is very much something that would have to be graduation criteria and gateway API.
You're going to need a consult from the cell folks because I don't know enough about how to make a type which has automatic cell validation, right? Like in the fullness of time in the future, everything will get first pass validated by built-in validation rules. So we'll be able to say you have a cube duration string and that will be automatically validated and people don't need to manually run that regex.
Yeah, so Joe has already been helpful on this specific PR issue, whatever. I think so. So the good thing is that Cell already supports this for the sake of validation in the sense of like min-max values, and that their duration parsing would work for this. It would work for, you know, a broader a superset of this format, but it also works for this format. So you can do min-max validation with Cell already using this format.
I think we need to, I personally need to make certain of exactly what happens when the Cell parsing fails. I think it does something reasonable, but we need to double check that.
Yeah. So I think we have pretty clear AIs for this. It is remarkably more complicated than you would ever think going into this, but yeah, thank you for the discussion. And
I don't know why
think
you're
we'll-
surprised by that, Rob.
Yeah, date and time always gets you.
So,
Always.
I think
Fair.
I personally was a little surprised because I'm accustomed to date and time being complex, but I'm also accustomed to handling durations as just subtraction and not worrying about it. So that's why I was surprised. It makes me feel incredibly naive personally. Do we also have broad consensus that replacing the meta v1.duration type is the right way to go as opposed to creating a new type?
I think I would approach this as create a new type, prove that it does all the things that we want it to do, and then say, okay, there's 8 places where we use meta v1 duration. Can we switch them all to this? And if so, we can reappropriate the name. I don't know enough about those contexts to say upfront whether it's going to work or not.
Okay.
So clearly you need meta v1 duration v2.
I was kind of thinking of meta v1.timestamp or dot timeout or dot expiration or something like that, but we can, there's definitely a certain poetry to
Cross
meta
that
v1.duration v2. What was that, Shane?
Cross that bridge and when we come to it in a minute here.
Meta v1 dot ugly, 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 and then that way we know it's not going to stick
I
forever.
like that one. I like that one.
We can do that, yeah.
That'll spook people. It'll be good. All right. We're eking up on the last 10 minutes here. Let's give Dave a chance to talk about gateway backend protocol selection. Gup.
Yeah, this is just a sanity check. So the problem is Gateway API doesn't have a way to specify backend protocols or hint backend protocols right now. So one of the options is because Kubernetes has these standard application protocols defined in the KEP enhancement. Right now there's H2C, WebSocket, and WebSocket Secure. This GEP sort of just proposes, hey, let's use these constants as sort of the hint. So this would then mean gateway implementations should look at the service app protocol to kind of know that, hey, you're intending for it to be this backend protocol. This then allows, for example, hey, you can have an HB route, do traffic splitting, and it can handle like multiplex over like HTTP and one, and also like WebSockets, because there's many servers that do that type of stuff. So the question I have is like, is there any objection to that? And then from this group, and also there are some sort of like open-ended questions. I wouldn't say that these questions preclude the GEP from being like accepted or merged. One of them is sort of this multiplexing. TCP UDP can be multiplexed. Can SCP do it? SCTP. And also like more complex protocols. I know Lior, I couldn't find your issue, but there was this concept of like gRPC was a standard app protocol, but because it has different transports, like how do you present that? And likewise, like you can also have WebSocket over HTTP2 and HTTP3 as well. So like right now, the existing protocols in the standard KEP reference specific RFCs. So those are HTTP1. So just thoughts, figured to raise the thing here and see what people think.
Go ahead, Leora.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I wanted to raise one thing. Maybe I'm mixing with something, but I watched the Gateway API design review, and there was a discussion whether we want to change Gamma in the future for cluster APIs or something like this. And then how would this coexist if we accept? So it just came up now. If we accept like looking at our protocol, so if we like change it from referencing to service, maybe it's not related. So but just something I just thought about.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the cluster gateway stuff. I would assume it probably, like, my assumption would be that you would still want a field there for the user could intent, for example, some protocols. So I could imagine similar constants could be used.
Yeah, though. Rob, looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like so much of Gateway API, including this discussion of app protocol, where we're trying to define the connection between the gateway and the backend, and assumes that there's some kind of proxy and not pass through, where currently cluster IP does not have that assumption. So again, I don't know what that means for cluster IP gateways. We haven't really gone in any depth.
Rob,
As
I misparsed what you just said. Can you say it again?
so, so far, every gateway implementation I'm familiar with, there's like it's like a proxy implementation, right? Where there is a unique connection from client to gateway and then gateway to backend, where like service, cluster IP, whatever, would be so far just pass through, right? Is that
I mean, is
I
that
use-
going to hold? Is that assumption holding true when we talk about L4? Like many of the clouds have load balancers that are VIP-ish that pass straight through.
yes, I agree. But that so far has not happened with Gateway API. I agree that that's a gap. And kind of what I'm saying is app protocol itself is something that seems to rely on this idea that there's a distinct thing between client and gateway, and then gateway and backend, and app protocol is defining the protocol to use between gateway and backend, which doesn't really seem to make sense in a pass-through world.
What would be correct for the Gamma future implementation? Where in Gamma you probably wouldn't go through the gateway, or like, you know. So
Within service
basically,
meshes, it feels relatively unlikely that you would expect one of the mesh proxies to translate protocols, because as you say, there is not a gateway involved. It's kind of a lower, you're not changing any context there.
The app protocol term, in my opinion, is being a bit overloaded, because it used to describe this, and then some implementations kind of describe what is the backend protocol that basically the backend accepted. So I'm just, yeah. So like, if say you have a service that gets a gRPC traffic or something, and then you basically what we require now, like how app protocol standards exist, because there's a service, it gets gRPC traffic, and we cannot differentiate whether, like, I don't know, it's gRPC or HTTP. So we basically reference the service for it. But if we gonna move the direction with, like, you know, not referencing the service, how would we derive this app protocol? Yeah.
Flynn, I think.
I thought Antonio was first, but I was going to ask Rob, do you see this thing as describing a requirement, or do you see it as permitting a description of a behavior when the gateway supports it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can only possibly be the latter one, because we're seeing more and more that there are examples where this cannot be supported, and I think that cluster IP gateways is potentially one of those in the future. Again, talking about something that's basically undefined at this point and just trying to use imagination. But
yeah, well, a use case that we definitely see with existing Ingress stuff is a client out somewhere in the world makes an HTTP2 connection to the an API gateway and the backend service only speaks HTTP 1. And so the gateway needs to do that translation. So I'm curious what's going to happen with the gatewayless gateway that you're describing in that world. Would you simply require that the backend service must be able to speak H2? And if so, what's your answer when the client out on the internet speaks H3 and the backend only speaks a TCP-based HTTP? So it feels that it is important to be able to describe what the backend is capable of at a bare minimum.
I just want to add that a few years back we had this HTTP 1.2 proxies were upgrading and downgrading traffic all over the place, and we're about to go into another phase with HTTP 3 to 2.1. So protocol upgrades and downgrades is something we're gonna have to live with. Right, every so often we get a lot of it and then it dies out, but it's just it's always there.
H3 is a particularly nasty one because telling all the people writing workloads, oh, hey, you have to be able to handle UDP now tomorrow is, challenging.
To say the least. Go ahead, Antonio.
Yeah, but there is one thing that I don't understand. So you can upgrade from HTTP2 to HTTP3 or whatever, but you cannot upgrade once you use gRPC, you are tied to HTTP2, for example. So there are things that you can upgrade, but there are others that you cannot. You cannot move from HTTP to HTTP3 to gRPC, for example. So what I don't understand in the request is, I mean, it's impossible that you can get inconsistencies depending on the protocols that you're using. So how flexible do you want to be here?
The intent of this, and also there's sort of a table in that GEP that says like if you're using this route and you're using this protocol, like this is compatible. And like so there's sort of like a recommendation. So for example, WebSocket should work with HTTP route as a front end. I think for like some of the stuff, like for example, like gRPC and WebSocket over like H2 and H3, those to me are sort of like, hey, we don't need it at the moment, especially with like HTTP3 being over UDP. Yeah, like that changes a lot of like people's fundamentals. So for now, like what this enables is H2C and WebSocket HTTP1. And as we figure out maybe this like HTTP3 stuff in the past, then we can extend this GEP to handle more and potentially advise like what you're describing, where people talking about like supported upgrades and things like that. Essentially, like this GEP is just saying like what's my hint to what the backend can understand, and it's using these standard protocols and defining the Kubernetes CAP. It doesn't make opinions on. Actually, I guess I'm like. It doesn't make opinions on upgrading and stuff like that, but there are sort of like suggested hints on like this is clearly going to be incompatible. And if, for example, HTTP3 wasn't a thing, then I would say like setting your Kubernetes service UDP and pointing HTTP route to it should be marked incompatible, but that's clearly not the case anymore. So so I kind of view the discussion about like protocols and upgrades to kind of be like separate from what is the mechanic to hint what the backend protocol is, if I'm being clear.
We are unfortunately running out of time. We're in our last minute. Sounds like you have a need for even more feedback, Dave, and discussion. Everybody who's been in this discussion, if you would go jump onto the pull request and do some async discussion to continue this here, we would appreciate it, so that we can move forward with it and figure out what the right thing to do is. I agree with Flynn's statement personally that having the ability to at least describe it makes sense to me. And also, Dave, if you want to put this one on the agenda for the next meeting too, so we can continue the discussion, that would be good too.
The next gateway or the next.
Well, we can certainly do it at the next gateway meeting, but we could also do it at the next SIG network meeting if it's helpful to get more feedback from this group. And there's not a ton of discussion asynchronously between now and then.
Like I can
in our
also
PR.
I can prune the gap. So like even though I have sort of like this recommended incompatibilities, like we could get rid of that and just let that be implementation dependent for now, and then just solely decide on, is this mechanic useful, and does everyone agree that the standard labels in this Kubernetes cap be a reasonable thing to use? So yeah,
Roger that.
and yeah, sounds good. So yeah, so please comment on the PR if you have if you have objections.
Roger that. Thank you for your hard work on this, Dave, and everybody who's involved in it. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. All right,
Commenting
we're
on the
gonna.
PR if you don't have objections might be handy too.
Yeah, that'll be helpful, so we can see if people are like, yeah, go for it. All right, thank you, everybody. Until next time.
Thank
Have
you.
a good week.
Well,